Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar that is being hosted for the third phase of the internship and summer school offered by Niti Manthan. This webinar is being hosted by the Niti Manthan Center for Environmental Law Research and Action, one of the first centers to be set up under the organization of Niti Manthan. Today we have with us Assistant Professor Charan Tej, an eminent faculty of School of Law, Christ Deemto-be University. Charan Tej, sir, will be talking to us today about the legislative mechanism for environmental law within India. Charan Tej, sir, is also a notable lawyer who has practiced with the NGT in the past and has had extensive experience practicing in the same field. Without much further ado, I request Charan Tej, sir, to start his lecture.
Thank you, Ajit, for the wonderful introduction. Okay. Could you see? I'm sharing a presentation. Could you see it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's come online. Yes.
Okay. So I hope
no, sir. There's
all
a
of you are
mixture
law
of
students here.
So some of our students are also from an engineering background.
Okay, engineering background. Very nice. It's nice to hear. See, I also have an engineering background. It's science plus law. Actually, the important aspect of environmental jurisprudence is about the impact that science has over law. Okay, that is one interesting aspect. Okay, shall we get to the topics? See, I've divided the entire discussion into environmental law and environmental jurisprudence because you cannot actually divide these two aspects of environmentalism. Okay, the law as well as the jurisprudence goes together. Okay, so in that aspect, I've divided this, and I'm not going to bore you with acts, provisions, and all these things. I'm just going to tell you simple stories, things that have actually changed the way we look at environment, the way we look at implementation of laws and everything. Okay, so firstly, first topic is environmental laws. Okay, so what do you mean by environmental laws? I mean, what are the sources of power for these environmental laws? Firstly, it is the constitution. The second one, it is the statutes. Third one is the judicial verdicts, or we call it as judge-made laws. And last one is the delegated legislation. Okay, so now take a brief time and we'll go through all these things, and then you'll have a clear picture as to what is environmental laws, and then we'll go to environmental jurisprudence. So firstly, since there are engineering students, I'll tell you. Okay, firstly, constitution is the source of all powers in India. Okay, all laws, every structure, every institution, every function derives its power through the constitution. Okay, so it is the ultimate power, and there are certain things that gives this constitution powers to create environmental laws, or even as citizens, we to enforce or to ask for what is ours. Okay, we go basically from the constitution. So firstly, we have something called as fundamental rights, FR is fundamental rights. Okay, and here are two important things that you just need to know, that one is right to equality, and the other one is right to life and liberty. Okay, right to life and liberty. One is article 14, another one is article 21. Forget about the articles, just remember, understand that there are two things, that is right to equality, and the other one is right to life and liberty. Okay, so what is this right to equality? When we talk about right to equality, the basic premise is that, see, we are all born equals. Okay, and everyone has an equal share of, with respect, I'm specifically telling with respect to environmental laws. Okay, environmentalism or environmental jurisprudence. Okay, when we talk about right to equality, all we say is that everyone has equal access to all the things that nature has to offer to us. Okay, equal access. So when you talk about equal access, see, for example, you take a glass of water. Okay, everyone has an equal access to clean water. If at all the state, that is the government, is not providing you clean water and someone else is getting clean water, then you have a right to actually question the government. Okay, that is right to equality, which means that everyone has equal access. I mean, without any differentiation between the rich and the poor, the one caste or the other caste, one sex or the other sex, one religion or the other religion. Okay, irrespective of all these things, we have an equal access. Okay, and then second one is right to life and personal liberty. Okay, that is article 21. Under article 21, right to life and liberty, one important aspect is right to clean environment, which states that every citizen, okay, every citizen has a right to clean and healthy environment. Okay, if at all the states fails to provide you clean and healthy environment, then you can approach the courts and ask the courts to direct the state, okay, to provide all these things. So now the entire fundamental rights is based on the concept of the states providing certain aspects or performing certain duties towards the citizens. Now here comes the biggest question as to what do you mean by state? Okay, what do you mean by state? Okay, so the under Article 12 under the Constitution, state is defined as uh, central government, state government, other agencies that work under the central government and state government, local bodies, your Panchayat Raj institutions, your municipal bodies, all these constitute states. These public service, I mean, public sector undertakings, PSUs like ONGC, SAIL, all these things constitute state. And then also other private agencies who are performing certain functions, certain governmental functions or public goods functions, they are also considered state. So if at all your right is violated, right to equality or right to life and personal liberty, in this case right to clean and healthy environment, if at all this is violated, you can directly approach the courts. And there are two things, one is the Supreme Court, the other one is the High Court. Under fundamental rights, under Article 32, you can directly approach the Supreme Court. Otherwise, you can also approach the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution. So whatever rights that you derive, whatever questions that you're going to ask, whatever actions you demand of the state government, you ask it through the fundamental rights. Okay. Then we have DPSP. DPSP is nothing but policy, directive principles of state policy, according to which Article 48, okay, under DPSP is nothing but directive principles of state policy, which means that directive principles, if at all a state is going to frame a policy, okay, if at all a state is going to frame a policy, what are the principles that should be governing these state policies? You cannot frame a policy which is against, a state cannot frame a policy which is against the interest of the public. For that sake, they created something called as DPSP, Directive Principles of State Policy. So it contains all the which entailed as directive principles. That is, it is these aspects that govern the state. So what happened initially in the DPSP, environment was not a component. Okay. However, in the year 1976, okay, something called as 42nd Amendment Act was enacted. Under this, 48A was put in place, saying that it is the duty of the state. Okay, it is the duty of the state to protect and improve the environment and safeguard forests and wildlife. Okay, to this effect, the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. Okay, so it is the state's duty. Okay, it's the state duty. Okay, if at all you are adopting certain things, okay, if at all you are coming up with certain policies, you have to improve the environment and safeguard the forest. Then comes fundamental duties. Okay, now just as certain duties have been imposed on the state, subsequently some duties were also imposed on the individual citizens, and that is coming under fundamental duties. And according to which Article 51A, yes, every citizen should contribute towards protecting environment and forest. And then what is the seventh schedule? Okay, seventh schedule is nothing but distribution of subjects, which means that, see, if you go to a class, in your classroom, be it engineering, be it law, there are every person is given a subject. Okay, every faculty is given a subject. It is, if a particular faculty is going to take, okay, say electronics, digital electronics, he is going to take only digital electronics. He is not going to take electrical machines 1 or machines 2. Okay, he is only supposed to take digital electronics. Similarly, if someone is going to take electromagnetic theory, he is only supposed to take electromagnetic theory. Okay, and not solid state drives. Okay, so this is called as division of subjects with respect to here. Okay, so every faculty is given one particular subject, and they are going to teach only that particular subject. Similarly, see, Indian system is divided in such a fashion that we have a central government and we have state governments. And now what has to do, see, if at all there are too many people taking the same subjects, just as the saying goes, okay, too many cooks spoil the broth. Okay, similarly, if there are too many cooks cooking the same dish, then it won't be palatable. Okay, so that is why what they did, they divided the subjects, saying that, see, let the center take care of certain laws, while the state may take care of certain laws. Okay, and that is called as seventh schedule. Initially, forests and wildlife are part of the state subject. So states alone, that is the state government of Karnataka or state of Tamil Nadu or state of Andhra, state of Maharashtra, the state, respective states alone were empowered to make laws in this subjects. Okay, however, later through an amendment that was put under the concurrent list. So now what happens, even the center as well as the state can make laws with respect to this. However, there are certain other things in which still the states have, such as pollution, health, etc., etc. Even during the COVID times, we saw that what empowers state. See, COVID was initially detected, and initially widespread cases were detected in Kerala. So ultimately, it is the Kerala government which came up. Okay, Kerala government took upon itself to come out with mechanisms, to come out with laws to deal with the health crisis. Okay, so where did it derive its power? Because health is in the state list, which means that it is the state which is given the power to maintain public health and cleanliness. Okay, now then how did the center, the first lockdown at 8 o'clock it was announced, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock it was announced, how was it announced? If state have the power, how can the center announce it? For that, what they did was they went through a different route. Rather than going through the health route, they imposed this crisis as a national disaster. When notified as a national disaster, ultimately this center took hold of that power, and accordingly, when it's a disaster, it is the center which has the power. So it declared like that. So similarly, certain laws such as forest and wildlife were placed under concurrent list, so that not just the state, let's not leave it to the state to do all these things, let the center also participate in that. Okay, so this is the first base from which the environmental laws arise. Okay, it is the constitution that gives you the power. Okay, so far anyone is not clear may ask, because there are engineering students. So if at all you're not clear, you may ask anything. Yes. Clear? I mean, someone could unmute. Ajit?
Yes, sir. So I think it is clear for everybody. Some of them are replying through the chat box as well.
Okay. So now, what are these statutes? Statutes are nothing but laws. Okay. How are these laws? So I mean, for the sake of understanding it easily, I've divided these laws into laws that protect wild habitats and laws that protect civilized habitats. Okay, so now what is the wild habitats? So what are the laws? Generally, I'm not going to go into the details of what are the laws and everything, but I'll generally see there is something called as Wildlife Protection Act. There is something called as Forest Conservation Act. And then comes the notifications such as EIA notification, that is Environmental Impact Assessment notification, Coastal Regulations notification, then Biodiversity Act. All these things are nothing but statute. And what are they doing? They are protecting the wild habitats, such as the pristine forests, etc., etc. Okay, the pristine nature, the hills, the mountains, all those things. Okay, so those are the statutes that protect wild habitats. See, when we talk about environment, we are not just dealing with certain aspects of environment. We are dealing in whole scale. Okay, so when you talk about whole scale, it includes the wild habitats. And when I divided it into civilized habitats, my intention was to actually say that where all we as humans have encroached upon the wild habitats. Okay, where we have concretized, we have removed the greenery, we have removed the a lot of aspects of environment, what we call as environment. So those are called as protecting civilized habitats. So what are the basic laws that are put to to protect civilized habitats. See, even civilized habitats have environment, as well as wild habitats also come under environment. So for civilized habitats, what is called as AIR Act, or Air Prevention of Air Prevention Act, okay, Pollution Act. Water Prevention of Pollution Act. Okay, there is Air Act, there is what, even under that there are notifications such as municipal solid waste waste rules notification, and then we have urban development notification. That is a state subject, that is a local body. Similarly, we have biomedical waste. Okay, biomedical waste actually collects waste from hospitals. How are we going to treat them, etc., etc. So the laws, generally environmental laws, can be broadly classified as those laws which are protecting wildlife habitats, wild habitats, and those laws which are protecting civilized habitats. So these are the basic laws that come under environmental laws. Okay, then the another important source for environmental laws are nothing but judicial verdicts. Okay, firstly, doctrines. Okay, I think Vidya ma'am engaged you people last week or sometime. I think she would have briefly gone through all the doctrines. So I'm not going to go through all the doctrines. I'll just, those are the doctrines that have derived out of judicial decisions, such as polluter pays principle, equality principle, etc. There are 5 or 7 doctrines, around 7 doctrines, and all those doctrines are derived out of judicial verdicts. Okay, even that holds power as an environmental law. And one of the most important such doctrine that the entire globe is vested with is common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, which was brought in by the Kyoto Protocol. So according to which, see, common but differentiated responsibility, even that we also follow in India. See, common but differentiated responsibility, it is actually divided into common responsibility, differentiated responsibility. Okay, what is this common responsibility? Our common responsibility is to collectively protect the environment. Okay, collectively protect the ecosystem. So that is called as common but differentiated responsibility. So that is common responsibility. The second aspect is differentiated responsibilities. What is this differentiated responsibility? It means that yes, we all have a common responsibility to protect the environment, but we have to divide the responsibility into the aspects, I mean, based on the aspects of contribution, which means that who has contributed more to this scenario, okay, to the current scenario, and whoever has contributed more has to do more in terms of responsibility, and whoever has contributed less has to do less in terms of responsibility. So see, industrial revolution took place in 3 phases. Okay, first one was the English and the French Revolution, Industrial Revolution. The second phase of Industrial Revolution took place in America, while the third phase of Industrial Revolution took place in the continental Europe, that is Germany, Italy, and all those aspects, Russia. This is the third phase of Industrial Revolution. So who are the beneficiaries of all these 3 revolutions? If you could see, it is the Americans, the England, and the continental Europe, Russia. Okay, Japan, obviously, Japan was also. So these are the nations which have benefited out of industrial revolution. And the problem that we face today in terms of ecosystem services or global warming or whatever, the reason is even mass extinctions that happen in oceans because of transport industries and etc. The reason is because of this industrial revolution. However, the fruits of this industrial revolution have been born only by these people. Okay, they have only accumulated the fruits of this industrial revolution. That is why this developing, underdeveloped status is being sorted out. Okay, so they have derived the fruits of industrial revolution, and so they are at a better place. Okay, now only because we call it as common responsibility, you cannot impose, okay, equal liability on the other underdeveloped or developing nations also. Okay, so they said that common responsibility, yes, we do accept that we all have to collectively come together to work through it. However, we also need to have differentiated responsibility. Since you have accumulated the fruits of industrial revolution, and it is because of the industrial revolution you have gained such an economic status, subsequently we are at a disadvantage only because we did not bear the fruits of the industrial revolution. Now is the time when we are supposed to develop. And now if you impose the same liability, say 1,000 rupees fine on everyone, how is it even proper? How is it even fair? So they said that whoever have actually accumulated the fruits of industrial revolution, let them pay more. So that is called as common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR. Now after 2015 Paris Convention, they have added two more things. Okay, common but differentiated responsibilities, and RC, which is respective capabilities. Okay, common but differentiated responsibilities according to their respective capabilities, which means that every nation will voluntarily pledge, saying that this is our capacity, this is what we can do. Okay, we can't do anything more than this. So your own pledge, you pledge that we will reduce the carbon output to such an extent, every country has come up with their own limitations or standards. So common but differentiated responsibility we do accept. But here the dilution was that previously under the Kyoto Protocol, we were divided into annexed and non-annexed countries. Now they said that let's not divide it into developing, underdeveloped, or non-developing countries. Everyone has to contribute, but everyone according to their respective capabilities. So that is one of the most important governing principle at the international environmental jurisprudence or environmental laws, and that is also a part of this. Okay, now one of the important doctrines that is usually applied in the courts is polluter pays principle. Okay, it is called as polluter pays principle. See, an interesting case was there, a lake, okay, a man-made lake. It was under the uh, control. Okay, it was under the control of the PWD department. Okay, it was under the control of the PWD department. However, the local body, the municipality, was dumping waste there. The municipality was dumping waste. I mean, during the summers, it gets dried up. Slowly, they started dumping waste, and the leachate, that is the solid waste, whichever is put over there, over a period of time, the biological waste will decompose. Once it starts decompose, the leach, when what we call as leachate is the extracts that come out of these. They flow into the soil, they also flow into the lakes. So that started polluting the lake. Ultimately, the lake became unusable. Okay, the lake became unusable. Apart from this, as it was just as the lake became slowly a garbage dump, on the side, people used to bring dead bodies and burn them there. Okay, it was also informally used as a crematorium. Okay, so there were these three activities happening. The lake belonged to the Public Works Department, PWD. However, the pollution were done by two people. Okay, pollution was done by, one is the municipality who was dumping waste because they did not have anywhere else to dump the waste. Okay, secondly, by the people who used it as crematorium. Since you people are from Bangalore, the same went with the Alsur Lake. Okay, what is happening is, yes, it is polluting. Who are polluting? The lake belongs to one person. Okay, I mean one government department or someone. The pollution is done by industries or someone else. So now in this interesting case, what happened? Who is going? This was put up in the court, and the court was looking at, okay, fine. See, the underlying verdict is we have to remove the garbage, we have to replenish the water, we have to revive the lake. There was no doubt about it. But on whom are we going to impose the penalty? Okay, so that was the biggest question. So at that time, the court was saying that the major polluter is the municipality. Yes, so they have to pay for the entire revival of the lake as well as removal of the garbage and fencing and everything. Okay, they said that you have the biggest liability. You know that it's an environmental place, it's a lake, and you still dumped. So here polluter pays. Now with respect to crematorium, the people who trespassed, who came in, okay, we never know who did that, so they let it go. But the biggest liability was also placed on the Public Works Department. Okay, they said that, see, you are the owner of the lake. Okay, you are the owner of the lake. You know that there is people are coming and burning, using it as a crematorium. Number one. You also know that municipality has been dumping waste, and it is not just one day or 2 days. They have been dumping it for years together, and yet you remain silent. Okay, that is contributory negligence. Okay, so you have also contributed for polluting this place. Okay, so though you may claim that, see, I have not done anything, only the municipality was dumping waste, still you kept silent when all the degradation was happening to the lake. So you are also equally liable for all these things. If you could actually relate to this with the 2G spectrum case, there were claims that our late Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, had knowledge of this issue. Okay, so but though he had knowledge of this issue, he did not respond. Okay, but ultimately one person was made the scapegoat. Okay, and he was removed from the cabinet. All these things happen. However, the people gave the verdict saying that enough is enough, you have robbed us enough. Okay, the reason is, though one particular portfolio minister or department is being accused of all these things, still, okay, you have remained silent. That amounts to contributory negligence, and so you are also equally liable. So the both the PWD as well as the municipality were imposed penalty, fine, as well as uh, reviving the entire lake. Okay, so this is how these doctrines actually help. Okay, they become the grounds for environmental laws. Okay, similarly, okay, certain aspects which came that as wetlands. Okay, the judicial order which said that no more, okay, wetlands are going to be converted into sites. If you could remember, in the year, if I'm not wrong, the year 2016, I suppose, there were massive floods in Chennai. Okay, there were massive floods in Chennai. A lot of houses were inundated. A lot of buildings collapsed. Lives were lost during this 2000. Okay, so the prime reason, okay, it was found actually converted the lakes to and everything. Okay, so then the Supreme Court said that hereinafter we are not similar is the conversion of lakes. They said that no more water bodies are going to be converted in any commercial sites. More recently, if you remember, the judiciary said that the reverse osmosis plants are not to be installed anymore. If at all you're going to install reverse osmosis plant, you need to have a report of the TDS, total dissolved salts. You have to test the water, you have to first the total dissolved are higher. Okay, and only then you have to go for the RO plant. Otherwise, you're not supposed to go to the RO plant. So these are certain judicial verdicts which form the basis of environmental laws. Okay. Then the most important aspect is delegated legislation. What is this delegated legislation? See, take your college, for instance. There is the vice chancellor and there is the principal, and then you get deans, and under then you have HODs, then you have class teachers, and then you have class representatives. So yes, the basic principles and basic laws are devised by the vice chancellor. Okay, then he gives up certain powers to the principal to make laws. Okay, he'll say that with respect to this, you can take the decision. Then the principal also says that the deans are given certain powers. For example, if you approach for a leave, okay, leave or some issue, okay, they'll first look at it whether dean is enough. Certain issues you need the sanction of the central government, I mean the vice chancellor. For certain things it is enough if your class teacher says yes, it's fine. For certain other things, all that you have to do is approach the dean, and if the dean is fine with it, everything is sorted. So this is how the legislation, that is the power to enact laws, is delegated. And what are these delegated legislation? Nothing but rules, bylaws, notifications. If you could see the entire COVID scenario, you would see that it has been a rule by notifications, which means that there is no law. Today, the central government will say one thing. Okay, and then tomorrow they'll say a notification will come. According to the news, were replenished with lot of facts saying that according to the government notification, notification by Home Ministry, notification by Health Ministry, notification by so and so, notification by state government. Okay, this is called as rule by notifications. So why I'm telling you rule by notifications is this is the important aspect or the drawback of litigation also. Once we go into the courts, it is not the law, it is the notifications, the gazette notifications, the rules and bylaws that accumulate, and that is what decides the cases. And examples of those are the coastal regulations or notification, the environmental impact assessment notification, the municipal solid waste management notification, the biomedical waste management notification. These are all notifications. These are done by executives, not the legislature, which means that the legislature delegates these powers to the executives and says that yes, people, you can come up with rules and bylaws and they can be followed. For example, the BBMC, Bangalore Municipal Corporation, okay, they comes up with laws with respect to pollution. They fix norms with respect to how much penalty has to be imposed in case you dump. But this is not coming from a law, but this is coming from BBMC, and that is through notifications. Any doubts so far?
No, sir.
No,
It's
sir.
clear. Charan sir, are we audible?
The Union Carbide. Okay, after the Union Carbide pollution case came new laws.
Excuse me, sir. Really sorry to interrupt, but we lost the connection in the middle.
Yes.
Could you repeat?
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, sir. You
Okay. So influencers are nothing but those things that impact lawmaking. So lawmaking is done by the legislature and certain things impact the lawmaking. So what are those things? Those that is called as triggers. The first influencer is the trigger. There'll be immediate triggers or gaslighting. Okay. What gaslighting is that will immediately lit the flame. If you look at the Juvenile Justice Act of 2013, the immediate trigger was the rape of a girl in Delhi, Nirbhaya rape case. Okay, that was the trigger. The protests were the trigger. So there are several protests. Okay, several protests that bring about lawmaking. Okay, so that are called as triggers. Then we come up with committee reports. If you look at any law, usually that is being made, it will be preceded by the formation of a committee, and it is these committee reports that influence lawmaking. So now here you have to remember one thing. Okay, a lot of committees will be set up to look at laws, to come up with laws. Not all laws, all committee reports are translated into laws. The best example is with respect to protecting the Western Ghats. Originally, a called Madhav Gadgil Committee was constituted.
excuse me, sir.
Gadgil
Really
yes,
sorry
again.
to interrupt. Like the PPT is not being shared anymore.
Now,
1 second, sir. Yes, sir. Now it is. Thank
okay.
you, sir.
Okay, the second one is called committee reports. So committee reports usually see the important drawback of this committee reports is you will form a committee. Yes, it's fine. Why? I mean, the media, government will all thump their just saying that, see, we have formed a committee and all these things. Once the report comes, we'll make laws, we'll make changes, everything is fine. But why are not all the committee reports translated into laws? Okay. The important aspect is the committee report should satisfy the legislature, okay, or the parliament, the lawmaking bodies, the executives. Only if they are satisfied with these reports, okay, uh, then they will enact these laws. I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you just give me a minute? My charger is drained. I'll just plug in the
Yes, sir. Sure,
charger.
sure. No problem.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are.
Okay. I'm sorry for the interruption. Okay. So with respect to committee reports, I'll give you a very basic and best example is with respect to protection of Western Ghats. Originally, a committee was formed under Professor Madhav Gadgil. Okay. Madhav Gadgil came out with a report saying that almost 70% of the Western Ghats has to be protected. Almost 70% has to be protected, and we have to, you know, move the people from these zones to the outer zones and everything. However, this created mass protest, hysteria. Hysteria was caused among the public. They said that we can't leave these places. We have been living here. So ultimately, what happened? The government formed another committee, Kasturi Rangan committee. Okay, that committee again visited the same questions and they came out with a different report. Okay, and that report was a bit favorable to the government. So accordingly, they started enacting laws. So which means that these committee reports for everything will form a committee. But unless the committee reports are favorable to the government, which means that the government should get some sort of mileage out of those reports. Okay, be it as a vote bank, be it as a crown or something like that. Unless they get a favorable report, those committee reports would not be implemented. Okay. However, these committee reports are influences. Second one, litigation. Litigation is nothing but cases. Every time a case is come up in the court and the court come up with the verdict, and those verdicts are translated into laws. So even the litigation acts as an influencer to the lawmaking. Then research projects, reports. These are international researchers, statistics, data. For example, protection of wildlife. Say Project Tiger. How did they come up? Because someone somewhere has published a report saying that the numbers have dwindled. Tigers numbers have dwindled. So then IUCN Red List, okay, International Union for Conservation of Nature, they came up with this Red Data book, contains details of animals and everyone which is endangered and everything. Okay, so those aspects influence lawmaking. And similarly, the protests. Okay, protest by people. There was a protest where they were doing this gel protest. They entered the lakes, they half waste women, children, adults, men, everyone was standing in the lakes and they were protesting against encroachment upon their property. Remember this Narmada Bachao Andolon. Okay, they're actually protesting against all these things. Sometimes these protests turn into law, sometimes they don't. Just imagine the protest with respect to the array forest that happened in Mumbai. Okay, these protests went to the form of litigation and then it went to the changed into the form of stopping the cutting of the array trees. Okay, then the next government came up with a law saying that we are not going to disrupt it. And most importantly, what influences lawmaking in India and everywhere is lobbying. And who are these lobbyists? Okay, it's quite obvious. The biggest lobbyists are nothing but who are going to benefit the most out of the law. Okay, they are the biggest lobby. Sometimes even the protesters become a lobby. When the protest becomes big, they become the lobby. But most often it is not the protesters who are the lobbyists, but it is the immediate beneficiaries of a particular law. That is usually the capitalist interest, the business interest, the political master's interest. the immediate family of the political masters, all these are the lobbies. And another important aspect of influencing this law is nothing but a fancy term called criminalization of politics and politicization of criminals. Okay, what is this criminalization of politics? Which means that nothing but criminals entering into politics. Okay, you can see slowly the criminals will start entering once they gain money, once they gain clout, once they gain power within the party and everything, they enter politics. You remember election commission and everyone coming out with these statistics saying that so many people who are part of the parliament are actually having criminal cases launched against them. So that is criminalization of politics. The second aspect is politicization of criminals, which is nothing but the politicians patronizing criminals. Okay, they do favors, they do aspects, they do things, okay, to promote the interest of the criminals so that their own self-interests are being promoted. How does all these things influence lawmaking? Think about the sand mafia. Think about the mining mafia. Who are these mafias that we call as land mafia, mining mafia, sand mafia? They are nothing but either patronized by the politicians or who start there as sand mining mafia and they slowly enter into politics. So this is called criminalization of politics and politicization of criminals. How does this influence lawmaking? Okay, uh, any law before it comes into force, or even even before they make laws, you will see something called as rush. Okay, you remember the gold rush, the famous term called gold rush, where everyone was running after the gold. Similarly, if at all a law is going to come, if you could see the plastic ban. Okay, the government came up with a plastic ban like 5 to 6 months or 8 months before the government actually comes up with plastic ban. You will see a flurry of industries coming up with this eco-friendly products, eco-friendly plates, eco-friendly spoons, spoons that you can choose, spoons that you can eat, whatever. Okay, so these are all products. How do these industries come into the picture just 2 or 3 months before making a law? So this is nothing but the lobbying, how politicians and capitalist nexus happens, bureaucrats nexus, all these things come into play into bringing up laws. Okay, so these are the predominant influences of lawmaking in India, and in particular with respect to environmental laws also, these are the biggest influencers. Now let's go to environmental jurisprudence. Now we've seen the lawmaking part, now we'll go to the jurisprudence part. The first thing that you have to understand is judicial activism versus judicial passivism. So what is this judicial activism and what is this judicial passivism? Judicial passivism means just the judiciary taking a step back and saying that, see, my role is only adjudication of disputes. So only when a dispute is brought in, we'll only adjudicate, but we won't make laws or we won't be proactive. Okay. Whereas judicial activism says that, see, we are going to be proactive, which means that if you fail to do your job, I will do your job. If you fail to do your job, I will do your job. Which means that if the lawmaking body doesn't make laws, I will make the laws. Okay, that is called as judicial activism. The entire environmental jurisprudence arose from in the 1980s. Okay, when the PIL revolution, the public interest litigation revolution took place, and everyone said that anyone can file a case if it is in the larger interest, if it's in the larger public interest. Okay, so that is what is caused the boom for environmental jurisprudence or environmental litigation. So today, anyone, Alsur Lake is getting polluted, you, me, or anyone can go to court and say that, see, Alsur Lake is getting polluted, I am being affected, so I'm filing this case. Prior to that, what was there is only the locus standi, which means that whoever is the aggrieved party, and who is and that aggrieved party should be party to the contract or the agreement. Only they can go and file the case. But they said that not anymore, which means that anyone can go and file a case. Otherwise, how could PETA file a case against Jallikattu, which happens in Tamil Nadu? Okay, they are no way related. They don't have bulls. They do not take part in the sport. Yet they filed a case and got an order. So that is judicial activism. and it is because of this there's so many litigations that come up, all the environmental verdicts that come up. None of them, I mean, most of them are not filed by parties who are actually part of the contract, or they are not the aggrieved parties. Even the non-aggrieved parties in larger public interest come up and file cases. So that is judicial activism. Next, this is the important aspect. Okay, this is more specific to environmental jurisprudence. Okay, continuing cause of action. So what is this cause of action, or what is this continuing cause of action? See, cause of action is nothing but the basic premise that has led to this reaction. Okay, for example, when you drink water, you all of a sudden come running to the kitchen and ask for water. Okay, you drink water. So what is the cause for the action of you coming and asking water? It could be hiccups. You get hiccups. So hiccups is the cause of action for you to ask water. Okay, similarly, when you go to a court, the first thing that they'll look at is the cause of action, which means that why did you come to this court? What happened? Okay, then you'll say that this happened. Take the case of a murder. You simply won't go to the court. You'll say that, see, this murder has happened. So that murder is the cause of action. Similarly, in environmental jurisprudence, if you at all you're going to approach the court, it looks for the cause of action. It's asked that, why did you even come here? Okay, so that is called cause of action. And now what is this continuing cause of action? See, something has happened 10 years back, and today I cannot go and file a case. I cannot seek remedy today saying that, see, I'm at a loss for this. So kindly give me the benefit. Okay. The reason is we have something called as limitation, which means that from the date of the cause of action, whenever that cause of action has occurred, from that date they keep a limit saying that within this period only you can come and seek remedy. If at all you go beyond the scope, beyond the limited period, you cannot come and seek remedy. Okay, however, the biggest change happened in the environmental jurisprudence when they came up with this concept of continuing cause of action. So what is this continuing cause of action? I'll give you an example. There was a case, okay, Kedarnath. Okay, Kedarnath case was there. In that Kedarnath case, what happened was helicopters were being flown frequently to ferry pilgrims. Okay, and in 2015 sometime this case was put up saying that, see, this is happening, and because of this there is Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary and Nanda Devi Wildlife Sanctuary, and animal and environment, plants, I mean birds and animals are being disturbed by this. So for this sake we are launching this case. The defendant said that, see, the helicopter service was started in the year 2006. However, you are filing a case in 2015. So you have barred the limitation. Limitation means saying that you have crossed the period. So according to environmental litigation, particularly going by the National Green Tribunal Act, 6 months is the limitation, which means that if today something has occurred, okay, within 6 months you have to file the case. Okay, within 6 months you have to file the case. If at all it is more than 6 months, then your case shall not be entertained. But then they adopted this principle of continuous cause of action. Okay, so what is this continuous cause of action? They said that though the cause of action might be one thing, okay, if that is continuing, which means that that cause of action is continuing, then it is called is recurring, it is called as continuing cause of action. For example, okay, a company was established, and it is letting effluents into a river. Okay, it has started leaving the effluents, say, in the year of 2017. Okay, today you're going to file a case saying that, see, I'm filing this case, and he cannot say that since 2017 I'm letting the effluent into the river. So the cause of action first arose in the year 2017. Today you cannot come and claim remedy for it. That said that, see, though you started it then, even today you're letting it out, which means that every day is a fresh cause of action. So that is called as cause of action. So this aspect of continuing cause of action is the important aspect in environmental jurisprudence. It is based on this that all the cases are being filed. However, there are certain conditions that you have to be fulfilled, particularly with respect to National Green Tribunal. Okay. The next important aspect of environmental jurisprudence is this is one of the demeaning or the what to say awful aspect of environmental jurisprudence, the politicization of litigation. So what is this politicization of litigation? So what happens is the officers of the court, okay, be it High Court or Supreme Court, the Attorney General, Advocate General, Government Advocate, Solicitor General, additional government pleaders, GPs, all these are appointed by the state, which is the executive at that point of time. For example, if you could see, once the government changes, immediately the advocates or the officers of the court who are advocate generals or government pleaders, etc., would remit their office and new set of people would take over the office, which means that these officers are nothing but party functionaries. Okay, they are some way or the other linked with the parties, okay, who come to power. And so once the party changes and new party comes to power, immediately these advocates will also change. Then what happens? Is the outgoing advocates, right, they belong to a particular party. So then they start politicizing these litigations, which means that everything they'll come up with a case, and the first thing they do is obtain a stay order or an injunction saying that this project should not go any further. Okay, then the other aspects of all these things flow. The delays in judicial processes owing to various reasons. The judicial delay is owing to various reasons, and the projects gets stalled. A lot of projects like this have been stalled because only for the reason of politicization of litigations. And then there is called as proxy litigation. This is nothing but the political parties directly do not indulge in litigation process. They will probably pay money or hire someone else to start a litigation, and so that they can disturb the government or block the government from enacting certain laws or coming up with certain principles. So this is called as politicization of litigation. And today what is happening is something called as waning environmental jurisprudence. One aspect of India's environmentalism has been the establishment of National Green Tribunal. Okay, nowhere in the world there is a separate tribunal for environmental related cases. Okay, India is the only country which has a separate judicial body to look after the cases with respect to environment, and that is called as National Green Tribunal. Okay, however, what has happened since its beginning, it has been going well, but since 2016-17, there are 5 benches, and out of them, the quorum, the capacity of every court has been diminished by sleeping over appointments of members. Okay, see, every NGT has to have a panel, a bench, which consists of a judicial member as well as an expert member. Judicial member as well as an expert member. So when they retire, you're supposed to appoint new persons. So when the new persons are not appointed, the bench doesn't sit and it becomes defunct. Okay, similarly, a lot of benches have become defunct, and right now only the principal bench sits, and everywhere else the benches are defunct, and no sitting happens in the National Green Tribunal. This is actually a distressing aspect, because when the NGTs were there, see, the basic reason probably for not appointing persons is stalling of projects. The National Green Tribunals and the benches were created so that everyone can reach out for environmental justice. When there is a southern bench, all the 4 states can reach out, all the people from there can reach out, and it does not it is not as costly as approaching a high court or another court. It is actually a bit cheaper because you can directly approach, and it National Green Tribunal doesn't strictly follow the procedures and all these things which the other courts follow. So even a common man can go inside, present his case and argue. Okay, you, me, anyone can go present your case and argue in the National Green Tribunal. So that sort of decentralization of justice happened. Okay, because of that, a lot of litigations came, a lot of trouble for the executives, a lot of trouble for the legislature, a lot of projects got stalled. All these things finally led to non-appointment of members, be it judicial member and be it expert member, and as a result the benches have become defunct, and now everyone has to go to the high courts to file a case, which is a tedious process, number one, which is a costly FIR, and you need experts, where I mean the advocates, to actually argue your case, okay, and get and the ubiquitous judicial delay. You have to deal with that also. So we were nowhere with respect to environmental jurisprudence. Then we went to a peak in the years 2013, 14, 15, and after that the environmental jurisprudence has seen an unprecedented dip. Okay, so these are all the aspects with respect to environmental jurisprudence. Yes, if at all you have any questions, see, there are a lot more to discuss. Okay, there are a lot of cases, interesting cases that I would love to discuss, but unfortunately, due to the paucity of time, I have to stop here.
Also, sir, we were thinking if you could give us like 2-3 instances of your practical experience.
Yeah, sure.
On the field.
See, not just my practical experience, I'll tell you one of the recent instances also. Okay, there was a mass protest in with respect to the Sterlite plant coming up with Thoothukudi, where people died. If you could remember, okay, it happened like few months back before the corona and etc. So what happened there? Okay, see, every aspect, this is with respect to politicization of this thing or lobbying, all these aspects you can take into consideration with respect to this case. So what happened was, when you start a company, you have to get approvals. You have to get approvals from a lot of persons, and one of those approvals is Pollution Control Board. So you have to get a sanction from the Pollution Control Board saying that yes, you can run this company. And even the Pollution Control Board, they have these different categories of industries, say red category, orange category, green category, white category. If at all you're coming up with a white category, which is if you don't, zero pollutant company, we used to say, which means that you do not pollute the environment, nothing comes out, zero effluent companies. Okay, if you are a white category company, you don't have to seek license from the Pollution Control Board. So when you look at the Sterlite, they have actually sought approval from the Pollution Control Board, and based on the pollution, and even in the Pollution Control Board, they give approval for two things. Okay, approval for sanction for establishment and sanction for functioning, which means that, see, I want to build this unit. Okay, say a copper smelting plant or a copper smelting plant. So I submit to the Pollution Control Board saying that, see, I want to establish the unit. They'll say that, they look at your plan, they look at everything, and they say that, okay, I give you the sanction to establish it. So once you have established it, then you will again go to the Pollution Control Board and say, give me sanction for functioning or approval for functioning, which means that, see, I have established all these things and these are the parameters and this is what you expect, which is the standard. Say that your particulate matter should be so much, effluent should not contain all these things, etc., etc. Okay, and I'll say that, see, I've put in all the protective mechanisms, preventive measures here. You can check the output and then you can give me the sanction. So that is how the process takes place. So there is a approval for establishment and there is an approval for functioning. Okay, so after establishment, the Pollution Control Board will come. They'll ask you to run the plant. Okay, they will check it for, say, 5 days, 10 days, how much of a time they need. And only after checking every parameter, they will actually give you sanction for functioning. That is when you can actually commercially start functioning your plant. So now in this case, what happened in the Sterlite case? So they got the Pollution Control Board approval for establishment. They got the Pollution Control Board approval for functioning also. So what was these protests all about? Okay, see, there are no concrete evidence behind all these things, but what can be presumed? See, if at all a company or an establishment has the approval of establishment as well as the approval of functioning, if at all you are having some dispute and you're going to challenge that, you have to challenge it appropriately, which means that you have to go to the Pollution Control Board, lodge a protest. They'll come back, inspect, and they'll report. Okay, and otherwise you can go to the court and you can seek an injunction against producing or stopping the unit, stay order against the unit. But none of this happened. Okay, there was reports that gas was leaking, people were falling ill. But how was it provable? How are you going to prove it? So far, nobody has proven it. Even Sterlite today says that, see, we have all the approvals in our hand. We can present our case in the court and win it. If they, I mean, it could be lie or whatever, okay, but still it happened, which means that the due process was not followed. And the reason for this protest and not following the due process could be politicization of the issue, or lobbying, or even unfair competitive interests also. So any of these things could lead to such a case. Okay. And ultimately, even the state government bowed to the pressure and they closed down the entire unit. This is one latest case I'm telling you. I'll tell you one bad aspect of this. Okay, how this remember Ennore oil spill case. Okay, remember Ennore oil spill case. So where two ships collided, and oil was spilled and a lot of damage was also happening. So in this aspect, the National Green Tribunal took up on this case. And during that time, compensation was to be given, and there was an insurance company. Both the ships had insurance mechanism, and they said that, okay, we'll seek the insurance companies, let them pay. Everything was fixed. Okay, and the fishermen were asked for a week not to go for fishing, and all these things happened. Okay, as this process was going on, there were other litigants also. Other litigants. I was explaining how public interest litigation works. So anyone can come and join the litigation process and say that, see, I'm joining here in the larger public interest. So what happened? Two other litigants have joined the case, and the problem was that the money, the funds that are supposed to reach the people got delayed, because today new people have joined and there was multiplicity of processes. Okay, while we devise the beneficiaries, while the beneficiaries are devised by the forest department in consultation with the local public, then two other organizations came and they said that in that particular one other organization said that, see, we also have a lot of beneficiaries, let the fisheries department also accept our applications for getting the benefits of the insurance. So ultimately, there was doubling of work. Though originally a group of, the entire community was covered, later this organization came up with a set of applications which was nothing but duplication of application. Already the person who submitted their claims again through this organization submitted. Because of things, a lot of delays were happening. Ultimately, before a verdict could be reached, the National Green Tribunal became defunct. This is one other case. And I'll tell you one interesting case. Okay, there was Lordship Justice Sasidharan Nambiar, who was sitting judge at that time. Okay, there is no policy or no enforcement mechanism with respect to collecting and disposal of fecal waste from the houses. So what happened was in Kerala, this was happening. Not my words, it was the justice's words himself. Okay, it is the justice's words himself. He said that I know what is happening over there. Okay, then I was looking for, okay, what is happening over there. Then later it came to know that, see, the fecal waste is collected from the house through lorries, and in the night times they park their lorries over the curbs of the roads somewhere near the national highways or state highways, and they dump all the fecal waste over there. The reason was the local bodies and the municipalities did not have a mechanism, did not have a facility in place to deal with the disposal or recycling of this fecal waste. So initially what the judge did was he sought replies, he sought actions, everything. But ultimately on the day of the hearing, only 2 municipalities came over there. He got really angry. And that is when he said all these things. Don't tell all these things. I know what is happening, because he was also from Kerala. Okay, so he is saying, I know what is happening over there. You just let it do all these things, and they're dumping all these things on the streets by which diseases will come, and near the forest, near the wildlife reserves, it is very bad. So then immediately he issued arrest warrant to the commissioners and everyone of the entire Kerala state, the municipalities, local bodies. And he said that on the next hearing, I want every one of them to be present in the court. Otherwise, I'm not gonna leave you. And he issued an arrest warrant in this aspect. See, these are good examples of how judicial activism actually takes place. Okay, the judges take upon themselves to look into these environmental issues, to deal with these environmental issues, and saying that, see, if you're not going to do this, then we will be forced to do this. Okay, and then if you could remember this Indian Neutrino Observatory, which was supposed to come up in Bodhi Hills, under Bodhi Hills, Theni. Okay, it was an interesting case. It was an interesting case for the reason that though the intentions were good, though they had a proper expert body under which they have done this environmental impact assessment, everything, it was just not a notified or recognized body who should be doing that. Only for that reason, they said that, see, go back and do the EIA assessment, environmental impact assessment, from or through the appropriate body, and then come back. You may proceed with the project. Okay, it was only because of procedural or technical things that they get that case got dismissed. I mean, the project got stalled. And the important thing is, we cannot look this as a one-off project. If you are going to do this on a regular basis, saying that, okay, technicality and procedural we can overlook, then it leads to a lot of arbitrariness, and that is not something that a judiciary should entertain. Okay, so that is one aspect. One more important aspect is the seawalls case, where what happened, I mean, you all know that the coasts, some coasts recede and some coasts gain sand. Okay, some coasts are receding sand and some coasts gain sand. So what happened, the eastern coast, say Chennai, the coast, what was happened, the sand was receding. So what the fisheries department did was, they laid something called as groins. Okay, and there were nothing but seawalls. They lay it, and sand get accumulated over there, and on the once sand gets accumulated there, it will form a beach. Okay, it will form a beach over there. So that was the intention of the fisheries department. Unfortunately, the other aspect of it is that not in all cases it is actually good. See, when sand gets accumulated at one place, it means that the sand is not reaching another place. So whatever happens before the groins, at that zone, sand is getting accumulated. But once you cross the groins, sand is getting ejected. So this was one of the drawbacks. And once this was brought to the court, saying that the groins have to be removed. Okay, but then we depended on some scientific reports saying that the immediate impact and long-term impact. Then we showed the lordships a report from Australia. Okay, where they have successfully done this sea walls, building sea bridges, sea walls, and laying sea groins and everything. And they showed that, see, it cannot actually be completely predicted scientifically. It takes time, and you cannot, on the day of laying the groins itself, say that it is not beneficial. So ultimately, that case also went on for a long time, a lot of discussions, a lot of disputes, and etc. And with respect to sustainable development, I'll give you this one particular case. Okay, there was this particular case where there are thermal power plants. There was thermal power plants in Ennore region. Okay, and they were dumping fly ash. Okay, they were dumping fly ash along the Ennore Creek. What happened was, the dumping was so severe that it started polluting the creek. It started polluting the groundwater. It started polluting everything. I mean, the entire creek became lifeless. Okay, when this case came to the court, okay, how to prove this? How to prove this is, they formed an expert committee which consisted of people from IIT Madras, Anna University, etc., etc. Okay, they went on a fact-finding search. Okay, they went around, they collected samples for various kilometers for a period of 1 week. They collected samples. They came out with a detailed report which showed that even 3 to 4 kilometers away from the plant, okay, from the unit, the plants which are grown in the houses, the brinjals, the tomatoes, chilies, they contain trace elements. They contain elements of contamination by all these fly ash and everything. And the fishes they caught, they contain elements, trace elements, and all these things. And this was presented before the judge. Okay, once it was presented before the judge, obviously the lordship got so furious, and he said that how can we let you do this? I am going to close down the entire unit. You are not going to function anymore. Okay, so all this was happening, but at the same time, another mindful fact is that if those plants are closed, the Chennai would become powerless. There would not be any current. Okay, so what is the judge supposed to do? So here are two, I mean, this is what is called sustainable development. On one instance, you need to protect the environment. On the other instance, if at all that plant is closed, the power supply would be zero, and the entire half of Chennai would become powerless. So now what is the judge supposed to do? Okay, so here he took precedence of the human aspects, that is our own developmental needs. So all he did was, see, I'll give you time, but you are going to rectify it. I mean, they had these tunnels, these pipes, which were way beyond their validity, which are, if at all they are supposed to run for 10 years, they have crossed 10 years, some 15 years or 17 years, and there were leaks all over the pipes. Okay, so then he said that, come on, you're going to fix this, and in a week's time, you're going to reply to me as to what you're going to do and how you're going to do. Otherwise, I don't care if I don't have power and this institution, that is the National Green Tribunal, doesn't have power, but I'm most certainly going to shut down your unit. Okay, so that sort of strong jurisprudence also happened. And then this river restoration, there was this river called Kuvam, which runs across Chennai. In that aspect, what happened? Until 1996, 1997, that river was actually navigable, which means that people used to come from Andhra through that river to Chennai, sell products, and again take products from Chennai and go through that river to Andhra. So this was actually a form of waterways where trade and commerce was happening on the waterways. Ultimately, it became a dump of sewage. Today, if you go there, there is only sewage flowing. Okay, so then the same issue was taken up by the court, and though the government and everyone said that we'll rectify it, we'll change this, we'll do all this sort of remedial measures, still what the court did was, yes, I'm closing the case. Okay, this case shall not be there. I'm disposing the case and closing the case. But every 2 months, you're going to submit me a progress report. If at all the progress report is not there, I'm going to reopen the case. So this is an instance of continuous monitoring. Okay, we said that, see, justice should not just be done, it should seem to be done. Okay, not giving the verdict alone is sufficient, but you have to ensure that that verdict has been put to practice. Okay, so they said that every 2 months you are supposed to submit a report. If at all you're not submitting a report, then we will take you to task, will reopen the case. So even that sort of powers that were given to the were taken up by the judiciary, and all these things were part of the National Green Tribunal. But now the defunct nature of the National Green Tribunal is actually pity for all the environmental activists, all the environmental, I mean, eco lovers and everyone. We actually feel sad that, okay, this thing has happened, but unfortunately we are at a place that we can't do anything. Even after enacting a Lokpal bill in the year 2011-12, only recently, last 6-7 months, they have appointed the first Lokpal. So that is the state of affairs. It's not about having laws, it's all about implementing those, making them matter, making them functional.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insight that we really enjoyed. Every case was really interesting. Also, sir, if it's not any inconvenience, could you stay for 10 minutes for our Q&A session? Like,
yeah, sure. No issues.
So, first question, Ajit asks, what are some of the issues that a practicing lawyer faces while litigating before the NGT?
Practical difficulties. See, actually, we don't face too many practical difficulties in NGT. The reason is it does not follow the CPC. Okay, it follows just the natural laws. They say that you can follow any law. So actually, the practical difficulties are very minimum. And today, the only difficulty is we do not have the respective benches that used to function. Okay, when we had the benches, access to justice was there. The justice was not just accessible, it was also affordable justice. Okay, you don't have to go to the entire process of litigation, waiting for days to actually get things done. Here, your case can be heard on a day-to-day basis. Today, if your case is being heard, in a couple of days, you can actually ask for numbering your case and has to be done. The entire bench, the entire system was approachable. So all the things were happening. It was affordable, it was accessible, and justice was even readily available to take. Okay, but the only practical difficulty that we face is the lack of NGT and not the during the functioning of NGT. If all the benches are again functional, right, it would be a big blessing for all the environmental litigates.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. Now our intern Akshita has a question. Akshita,
Yes.
can you unmute?
Yes, sir. So you mentioned there is a disadvantage of the rule of notification.
Yes.
So could you repeat that, and elaborate a little?
Okay. I'll tell you this. Okay. With respect to litigation alone, I'll tell. Okay. See, when we used to make a point, right? When we used to make a point, we used to refer to a particular law, saying that under this particular law, say environmental protection, or say under National Green Tribunal Act, Section 14 says this. So under this, we'll do this. Okay. But when we come to the rule of notification, what happens is, under that rule, there will be several notifications, which means that today a notification will come enabling something, saying that we are constituting, district coastal zone management authority. Okay, and the district collector shall be the district coastal zone management authority. Then 10 days later, another notification will come and say that we further delegate these powers to district coastal zone management authority. 2 months later, another notification will come and say that we are again doing this. The problem is the government has all these notifications in their books. Okay, they have all these notifications ready at their disposal. But how would a common man know this? That is the biggest question. And even if the common man knows this, okay, what happens if tomorrow another notification comes? Okay, and bypassing the jurisprudence has been easy through notifications. See, I'll give you an example, this COVID example. Okay, once they brought in lockdown, our beloved prime minister announced to us, see, from this day onwards, from 12 o'clock onwards, there will be a complete lockdown. In the entire 20 minutes or half an hour speech, there will be one takeaway point, and that is from 12 o'clock we will be under lockdown. Okay, but did he ever mention what services will be available, what services will not be available? No. So what happened? How do we come to know of that? It is through the notification that is issued on the next day. Okay, they say that, see, Home Minister is allowing, the Ministry of Home has issued this notification saying that these functions are allowed, which is the emergency functions. Today they say that these are the emergency functions. Say foods, milk, food, groceries, and all these things. 2 days later, another notification will come saying that this is also allowed. 3 days later, another notification will come saying that this is also allowed. So this is called rule of notifications. Rather than coming up with one general rule, okay, or one particular law, they make rules and bylaws and notification after notification under the parent law. Okay, ultimately, so much so that everyone will get confused as to what is happening. So that is why I said it is the biggest disadvantage.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Understood.
So, sir, adding on to the question of the rule of notification. So, Shuk, who is an engineering student, he asks, when we talk about the rule of notification being a drawback to litigation, is there any alternative to the rule of notification?
See, crime. We take something called as crime. As simple, I'm describing to you simple. Okay, so we have something called as Indian Penal Code. Okay, most of the crimes are defined under Indian Penal Code. However, beyond the Indian Penal Code, we have other codes also, other criminal acts. For example, the Juvenile Justice Act also contains certain criminal provisions. The POTA Act, the MISA Act. Okay, so even for crimes, for example, the Gundas Act. Okay, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So all these acts are nothing but all the things that deal with the same type, that is the criminal acts. Okay, but we have so many laws. So the only alternative could be, okay, compiling everything and bringing it under one complete law. Okay, so that we know where to look at. The biggest problem with this notification is we don't know where to look at. Okay, we don't know what to look at. We don't know where it even exists. Okay. If at all it is in a compiled form and it is under one text, you can actually say that, yes, I know this. That could be the only alternative.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. We are done with the Q&A session. So
Okay.
thank you so much for all your valuable insights. We learned a lot, and the knowledge that we take away from this webinar is immense. And we really are grateful that you could join us for this webinar. We learned a lot. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.